El Zorro Plateador presents Myths for Today's Man. Stories, fables, and tales for a world in chaos. These days, all the life coaches tell you to embrace failure. Don't be afraid to fail, they say. Fail early, fail often, they say. All this is good, but the idea has become almost trite and lost most of its meaning. What you need is how to learn from failures, to embrace them. This requires that you learn to profit from them. When you grow your ability to profit from a failure, you get grit. Grit is the ability to profit from your failures. And when you have grit, you have the power to keep going, to endure. Grit, the many elevating failures of the Wright brothers. One example of how to profit from failure is Orville and Wilbur Wright, the famous aviator inventors from Dayton, Ohio. Though you know them for being the first men to develop sustained flight, what you don't know is that they failed in peculiar and powerful ways you need to understand. Their failures were the secret to their success. In this episode of Myths for Men, we learn about these failures and how they responded to them. And then we look at how what actually stopped the Wright brothers was not their many elevating failures, but something else, something that got in the way of their success. At the close of the 1800s, many engineers and daredevils wanted to fly. They became fascinated with the riddle of aviation, but no one knew how to build functional and safe aircraft. As history unfolded, the science of aviation sprang not from heavy industrialized machinery or advancements in chemistry, but from toys, from the science and engineering of bicycles. In 1889, two young men, Orville and Wilbur Wright, ran a fledgling printing shop in the bustle of downtown Dayton, Ohio. Being mechanically inclined, these teenagers designed, built, and operated their own printing press and had launched a weekly newspaper. At this time, a craze of riding bicycles had swept across the country. The older, penny-farthing bicycle, with its giant wheel trailed by a much smaller wheel, was dangerous, unstable, and difficult to learn. This style was being phased out and replaced by a new and much safer style of frame and design, one with two wheels of the same diameter. That was known as the safety bicycle, one we still use today. In 1892, the Wright brothers opened their own cycle shop, and, having a newfound facility with machinery and working with metal, they quickly began to repair, alter, design, and then manufacture their own models of safety bicycle. Having this opportunity to build their own bicycles gave the two brothers a set of skills and a cautious intellectual stance that they would later use for a much bigger and now world-famous project. As any bicycle rider knows, these men knew that tiny movements or shifts in balance dramatically changed the behavior and direction of the vehicle, and this phenomenon made them masters of instability, a talent that would become crucial over the next 10 years. By the turn of the century, another craze captivated the world: to achieve the rare state of being airborne. The Wright brothers caught this fever and in 1898 set out on their new mission, the dream to fly. To build a manned and powered aircraft capable of sustained flight. By no means were they the only aspiring aviators at this time. Several other like-minded daredevils experimented with wing designs and aeronautics. One pioneer was a German inventor named Otto Lilienthal, who flew in his gliders down man-made hillsides, but died after breaking his neck in 1896. Another inventor named Samuel Langley, a well-established professor, astronomer, and scientist, designed a number of powered aircraft but was unable to solve the problem of steering. The Wright brothers enjoyed a powerful strategic advantage over these competitors. Their 5 years working with bicycles had given them experience with a light device driven by a single human being that was dynamically unstable, that used rapidly moving mechanical parts and hurtled aerodynamically through the air. The prototypes of the competition imitated birds or enormous clunky fan blades, whereas the Wrights' approach was completely different. Their early gliders looked like bicycles. They were wobbly, light, and required the same quick reactions required to ride bicycles. They were brittle and lightweight and prone to break when landed too hard. In Ohio, they conducted flight tests in an open pasture named Huffman Prairie. While convenient, only 10 miles from their cycle shop in the center of Dayton, this large field was less than ideal for aeronautics. There were too many trees. The wind was unreliable, and the thick sod was lumpy, often squishy, and unforgiving for the hard landings of their delicate prototypes. The brothers needed a better place to test their aircraft, a more ideal location, one free of trees, with plenty of wind, and one providing a softer, flat landing surface. In 1900, the Wright brothers found a place perfect for rapid and profitable failures. This was at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The landscape had scraggly dune brush, but no trees. The wind was stiff and reliable, often providing enough lift while standing still, allowing them to test kites and stable aircraft with ease and convenience. The beach terrain offered high sand dunes from which to fly aircraft and wide open flat areas to provide soft landings that protected these frail gliders from damage during crashes. So began an incredible 8-year span between 1900 and 1908 of measured testing and experimentation that would change history. The key to their early success was early, controlled failure. There on the sand dunes of the Outer Banks, the Wright brothers ran test after test, in which they made many valuable errors and could observe intensely their incremental experiments and then iterate on them rapidly. The landscape of Kitty Hawk and their previous exposure to mechanical problems provided a geographical and technical advantage, but they also had an advantage in their scientific method. The Wright brothers also knew the value in being careful and scientific, so they developed tools to carefully and systematically observe flight. At this time, no aviator knew exactly how to shape wings to provide optimal lift. To study this, the brothers built a small wind tunnel, and into it installed a miniature wing that could accommodate quick variations in wing shape, known as camber, which means the asymmetry between the upper and lower surface of the wing that provides lift. Being able to vary camber in this test wind tunnel was critical. Their changeable wing allowed the brothers to execute hundreds of trials and collect their own data on wing aerodynamics with more speed and accuracy than previous engineers. This enabled them to design wings, and later on also propellers, with more efficient lift than any before. With these observational tools, they could make many cautious, incremental adjustments to camber design. In a series of tweaks, their scientific study of early aeronautics compounded across time to snowball into valuable differences, and these differences became the secret to their incredible success. Meanwhile, other aspiring aeronauts built their own prototypes, and competition was heating up. In nearby Virginia, Professor Samuel Langley had, in 1902, flown several small prototypes far enough to gain large government contracts from the Army. These contracts allowed him to develop a large glider he called the Aerodrome, which was heavier and boxy and ugly compared to the bird-like quality of the early, delicate models that the Wright brothers were testing in Kitty Hawk. The methods Langley used to design and test his aircraft were less measured, less incremental. His aerodrome suffered highly public failures, with his aircraft being launched by slingshot and then immediately breaking apart into the Potomac River. 9 days after this disappointment, the Wright brothers conducted 4 successful manned flights on the windswept dunes of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The message of this competition is revealing. The scientific method used by Langley and his team simply wasn't as powerful as the Wrights. The Langley team had technically overreached and failed in larger and less measurable increments across multiple areas that they couldn't track accurately, and so they couldn't learn from their mistakes. And Langley had also botched his publicity, using the press prematurely to promote his work. So when his tests failed, the backlash against him was swift and demeaning. Compare this recklessness against the calculated vigilance of the Wright brothers. They strategically underreached, failing technically in infinitesimal increments across tightly controlled areas that they carefully observed, and so they learned from mistakes constantly. They also took a secretive stance toward the press, either by avoiding it or making only gentle attempts to announce their smaller, more delicate aircraft. The cautious brothers knew it was too early for intense exposure. After they solved the problem of wing shape and lift, the young inventors needed to master the steering controls of the aircraft. At first, they rode the glider faced forward and prone, with hands on small levers to control banking and elevation. This was aerodynamic and daring, but it was also dangerous. They would later change the pilot's position from lying prone on the lower wing to sitting up. This upright pilot position allowed for more accessible controls, including the invention of the control stick, which simplified the input of steering characteristics of flight, such as pitch, roll, and lift, into a single instrument. This allowed the pilot to connect to the aircraft and respond fluidly and dynamically to wind gusts and the fundamental instability of the aircraft. Their early tests had inherited many of the traits and features they developed working on bicycles and printing presses. The brothers used technology of wheel spokes throughout their wing design to offer their structure a blend of tension and flexibility, and they used principles of machinery they gained from printing presses within their lightweight engine. These advancements were steady and cumulative. During the fall of 1902, they made nearly 1,000 glides, the longest lasting half a minute and traveling hundreds of feet. They were just beginning to cash in on the many careful lessons they had acquired so painfully, and their dream of remaining airborne was coming together. The final characteristic of flight they needed to solve was thrust. For this, they installed a simple aluminum gasoline engine connected by bicycle chain to two large propellers that spun in opposing directions, thus canceling out the destabilizing torque of the other. This was their first finished aircraft, the Wright Flyer, and piloting it over a series of powered rides in early 1903, the brothers quietly made history. They flew first for 10 minutes, then 12, then 15, then 40 minutes, each time getting a better feel for the sensation of flight and a feeling of control over the aircraft. These historic flights were the accumulation of their scientific method applied with incredible resolve upon their dream to fly, fueled by a competitive nature both brothers shared. It is here, at this point, during maximum difficulty, that the Wright brothers displayed the true grit they needed to succeed. In 1904, the first phase of testing was complete, so they moved operations from Kitty Hawk back to Huffman Prairie in Ohio. Here they set up the world's first airport with aircraft hangars and a launching apparatus. Over the next 5 years, they cashed in on their technical and scientific foundations they had laid, making steady advancements within all areas of their aircraft. Their early developmental period between 1898 and 1903 was one of unrelenting experiments and was followed by another 5-year phase lasting to 1908, which was one of intense change for the Wrights and their aircraft. This new phase contained developments across multiple areas of the fledgling aviation industry. The brothers made steady upgrades to their Wright Flyer with new variations coming out each year. but they also managed several other areas of their emerging public image. This included waves of wild publicity, steering the appealing myth of two plucky brothers, both blending their careful technological acumen with an insatiable thirst to defy gravity. They became the most famous people in the world. These were their show years between 1908 and 1916. In 1909, the Wright brothers reluctantly formed an exhibition team. Borrowing the showboating antics of circus impresario P.T. Barnum, they began putting on air shows around the country, including the Indianapolis Speedway and International Aviation Tournament at Long Island's Belmont Park. For this, they trained a handful of new pilots and advised them, carefully and repeatedly, to restrain themselves. But these men were not like the Wright brothers. They were willing to take risks, perform stunts, and push the aircraft to much higher elevations and distances, all thrill-seeking traits of the journey-oriented gypsy mindset. During these shows, the public would come and watch in astonishment at how these pilots were able to fly these planes. During this time, they continued to improve the aircraft. They built the Wright Flyer II in 1904, the III in 1905. After this, they began lettering their model names, starting with the models A in 1909 through E in 1913, each one built upon the last in the brothers' characteristically steady and methodical process. The fearless airshow pilots began performing feats of endurance. In 1911, they modified a Model B, which they dubbed the Vin Fizz, after a sponsor's new grape-flavored soft drink. In the first transcontinental flight, they flew the Vin Fizz from Brooklyn, New York to Pasadena, California, over the course of 3 months of difficult crashes and constant repair. There were many doubters, especially in France, where the technical problem of aviation was under great scrutiny. Many in France were justifiably skeptical of these Americans and their proclamations of flight. In 1909, the brothers traveled to France, put on wildly successful air shows in front of thousands, where they made historic flights and fascinated the teeming throngs of onlookers. They exploded in international fame. However, as Wright's stuntmen grew confident in flying the aircraft, they grew overconfident in ignoring the ground. These flyboys must have felt an intense need to feel alive because they would perform daring acrobatics and race against one another. Many of them took their playful games too far and crashed. Over time, most of these early pilots would perish, sobering the public's desire for flight. If flight was too dangerous for even these experienced pilots, then it was useless to the public. Most knew they could not take such risks, and in the fall of 1911, the brothers brought their exhibition initiative to a halt. By 1912, both brothers were exhausted from traveling to Europe, managing publicity, and growing their aviation business. But then, disaster struck. In the spring of that year, the younger of the two, Wilbur, caught typhoid fever, battled it for several months, but succumbed at age 45. Orville continued the business until his death in 1948, but the loss of his brother meant an end to their great partnership and marked another great shift across the science and business of aviation. The loss of Wilbur placed an instant ceiling over the growth of the Wright aviation business. Orville and the rest of the team at the Wright Company were demoralized. They struggled to move their business past the stage of air shows, where flight was a mere curiosity, a daredevil's show. They could not turn their light aircraft into the practical tools they would become in World War I. The first obstruction to growing their business was a fundamental marketing problem. They needed people to buy their products, but few wanted airplanes and there weren't many customers. The Wright Flyer III was a solution to a problem people didn't know they had. Flight was limited to being only spectacle, something one watched at air shows and expositions. There was simply too much danger and too little practicality in flight. The practical applications were narrow and mundane, such as delivering U.S. mail or grocery products. The Army, eager to gain air power, was quickly disappointed in the danger of these planes. They ordered 6 units of the Model C, the most powerful version, and all of them crashed. A statement from a 1914 government investigation delivered a crushing blow, indicating the elevator was too weak and condemned the Model C as, quote, dynamically unsuited for flying. One might expect a pioneer such as Orville Wright surely would become an incredibly wealthy juggernaut of the aeronautics industry. But something huge and unexpected got in the way. An impenetrable wall of ethics. Something that appealed to Orville's journey-oriented side. For the first time, his vision for the aviation industry was blocked, and he became lost. Historians speculate that Orville lacked the temperament to dominate the maturing aviation industry. But perhaps the limitation he encountered was more philosophical. A ceiling of idealism he hit, which then caused a devastating plateau. The public was unwilling to travel by air, but he knew he could sell the right models to the military, with it being so hungry for reliable aircraft. The military applications of aeronautics were obvious and quick to spur further development. But we must wonder, could Orville allow his great joy of flight and his fantastic airborne toy, a rideable motorized kite, be corrupted into becoming a deliverer of death? Would all of his honorable scientific work over the past 20 years, as well as that of his now-lost brother, be absorbed, twisted, and applied to wage war? Orville wasn't on board. He later lamented, "We dared to hope we had invented something that would bring lasting peace to the earth. But we were wrong." The science of aviation was quickly co-opted by the entrepreneurs who succeeded in the 1910s and 20s, who would receive their design priorities and funding from the military. Orville was ethically repulsed. He was reluctant to deploy his hard-earned aeronautical science in a questionable way toward military applications. He saw flight as beneficial to society and could not stomach his inventions being used to the detriment of society. This is the naive, simplistic stance of the innocent, of the light-hearted gypsy, and it devastated his business. Orville would later express this ethical reservation. He articulated his shock and dismay how, in World War II, where flight became a pivotal military advantage, the pure joy of flight could turn into an instrument of such destruction. He said wistfully, "No, I don't have regrets about my part in the invention of the airplane, though no one could deplore more than I do the destruction it has caused. I feel about the airplane as much as I do in regard to fire. That is, I regret all the terrible damage caused by fire, but I think it is good for the human race that someone discovered how to start fires, and that we have learned how to put fire to thousands of important uses." From the Wright brothers come powerful lessons about this mindset of learning. We can see how their stance toward obstacles made them more likely to choose the hard way, how it was for them a mode of being that actually needs and uses the hard paths as lessons, and how they took a courageous stance toward adversity, one that is resilient, robust, and ambitious. This powerful stance is one this mindset takes towards its ultimate end game, and its end game is that of mastery. The end.